The year is 1955. It is 3 a.m. on the Bosphorus. A thick gray fog, the Poyraz, has rolled in from the Black Sea, swallowing the minarets of the Blue Mosque and the Galata Tower. The city is silent, save for the mournful, rhythmic groan of a foghorn. In a small, nondescript wooden house on the water's edge in Kanlika, a man sits by a darkened window. He isn't looking at the view. He's looking through a pair of high-powered, military-grade binoculars at a massive steel silhouette cutting through the dark water. It is a Soviet Sverdlov-class cruiser moving slowly toward the Mediterranean. The man watches the deck, counting the radar arrays, noting the position of the guns, his hand moving frantically over a notepad in the dark. He is a local asset, paid in American dollars to be the eyes and ears of the West. But he isn't alone. In the hills above him, in a blacked-out Citroën, a KGB operative is watching the house, waiting for the man to leave so he can neutralize the leak. In Istanbul, the Cold War wasn't a distant threat of nuclear missiles. It was a whisper in a tea house. It was a poisoned needle in a crowded tram. It was a city where the person sitting across from you at the Pera Palace was either your contact, your killer, or both. Imagine a city where every alleyway has 3 exits and every person has 2 identities. A city that serves as the only door between the Soviet Empire and the Western world. Would you have the courage to cross the Bridge of Spies, knowing that in Istanbul, the only thing cheaper than a cup of coffee was a human life? To understand why Istanbul became the world's espionage capital, you have to understand the Montreux Convention. In 1936, a treaty gave Turkey total control over the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. During the Cold War, this made Istanbul the most important choke point on the planet. The Soviet Union's Black Sea Fleet, their only access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, had to pass through the heart of Istanbul. Every submarine, every destroyer, every grain ship carrying hidden missiles had to sail past the windows of Istanbul's residents. For the CIA and MI6, Istanbul was a giant permanent laboratory for observing Soviet military movement. But Turkey wasn't just a watcher, it was a participant. After joining NATO in 1952, Turkey became the Eastern Wall. The US built massive listening posts in Sinop and Diyarbakir. But Istanbul was the mailbox. It was where the Soviet defectors came to breathe their first air of freedom, and where the Western honey traps were set to catch Russian diplomats. The air in 1950s Istanbul was a heavy, intoxicating tapestry. It smelled of roasting chestnuts, salt spray from the Bosphorus, and the pungent blue smoke of Samsun cigarettes. You could feel the grit of the coal dust from the ferries on your skin. The city was a palimpsest, layers of Byzantine stone, Ottoman wood, and modern concrete, all crumbling under the weight of a new, invisible war. In Beyoğlu, the neon signs of the nightclubs flickered in the rain, casting long, distorted shadows on the cobblestones. You could hear the clink of raku glasses and the mournful wail of the clarinet coming from a basement bar. This was the stage where the spies played. It was a city of collective melancholy that served as the perfect camouflage for men who didn't want to be found. If the Bosphorus was the city's artery, the Pera Palace Hotel was its heart. Built for the passengers of the Orient Express, by the 1950s, the hotel had become a neutral zone where the war was fought with whispers and dossiers. Walk into the lobby in 1962. The smell is overwhelming, expensive French perfume, heavy Turkish tobacco, and the old-world scent of mahogany and beeswax. The lighting is dim,
provided by massive crystal chandeliers that seem to vibrate with the secrets told beneath them. You sit in the Orient Bar. The man to your left is a British businessman who is actually tracking a Soviet defector. The woman to your right is a Hungarian opera singer who reports back to the AVO in Budapest. The waiters are all rumored to be on the payroll of the Emniyet, Turkish security. You can hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the wooden elevator, the first electric elevator in the Ottoman Empire, as it carries guests to rooms where microphones are hidden behind every floral wallpaper. The atmosphere is one of polite paranoia. Everyone is watching everyone else through the reflection in their silver spoons. This was where Agatha Christie wrote Murder on the Orient Express. But in the 1950s, the murders were real, and the motives were always geopolitical. In 1952, a low-level clerk from the Soviet consulate walked out of his office on Istiklal Avenue to buy a newspaper. He was never seen again. 2 days later, a body was found floating in the Golden Horn, his pockets filled with stones. He hadn't been killed by the Americans. He had been killed by his own side. He was a triple agent, a man who was selling Soviet secrets to the British, who were then selling them back to the Turks, who were using them to blackmail the CIA. In Istanbul, loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a commodity with a fluctuating market price. What happens when a city becomes so crowded with spies that they start accidentally tripping over each other? How did Istanbul manage to survive as a NATO ally while being the primary playground for the KGB? While the spies were drinking raka in Beyoğlu, the real heavy lifting was happening in the hills. The Americans had built the Karamürsel and Sinop stations, massive arrays of antennas designed to vacuum every radio signal coming out of the Soviet Union. But Istanbul was the processing center. The data was flown into Yeşilköy Airport and then analyzed in secret villas along the Bosphorus. The Turks provided the muscle and the local knowledge, while the Americans provided the tech. Imagine a secret villa in Rumeli Hisari. Outside, the ancient fortress walls are covered in ivy, looking like a romantic ruin. Inside, the walls are lined with cutting-edge Ampex tape recorders and green-glowing oscilloscopes. The air is cool and dry, kept at a constant temperature to protect the electronics. The technicians sit with heavy headphones clamped to their ears, listening to the static of the Black Sea. Occasionally, through the noise, they hear a voice, a Soviet pilot talking to his base in Sevastopol, or a coded teletype signal from a submarine. They're eavesdropping on the heartbeat of the Red Army. You can hear the hum of the cooling fans and the occasional scratch, scratch of a pen as a translator scribbles down a Russian phrase. It is a world of pure abstraction. They aren't looking at people, they are looking at frequencies. But they know that if those frequencies change, it could mean the start of World War III. This was also the era when the deep state was born. Under the Gladio framework we discussed in the previous episode, the Turkish counter-guerrilla was being trained in the basements of Istanbul. They weren't just spies, they were enforcers. They were the ones who ensured that the Soviet influence didn't spread into the universities or the labor unions. They operated in the gray zone. Imagine a dark, narrow street in Tarlabaşı. The rain is washing the soot from the old buildings into the gutters. You hear the sound of heavy footsteps on the pavement, night watchmen, or something more sinister. A black car with no license plates pulls up to a corner. A man is bundled into the back. No struggle, no shouting. The city just swallows him. This was the Istanbul Noir. For every glamorous spy in a tuxedo at the Hilton, there were 10 men in raincoats doing the dirty work in the shadows of the old city. The smell of wet wool and diesel exhaust was the smell of the counter-guerrilla at work. Most people think the Cuban Missile Crisis was about Cuba. Spies in Istanbul knew better. It was about Turkey. In 1961, the U.S. had placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in the hills around Izmir and Istanbul. These missiles could reach Moscow in 15 minutes. They were the ultimate big stick, but they were also a giant kick-me sign. In October 1962, as the world stared at Cuba, the spies in Istanbul were watching the Soviet consulate. They knew that if a nuclear war started, Istanbul would be the first city to be erased. The Bosphorus would be boiled dry by a 5-megaton blast. The secret deal that ended the crisis, trading the Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the Soviet missiles in Cuba, was a betrayal that the Turkish intelligence community never forgot. It proved that in the game of spies, the bridge is always the first thing to be sacrificed. You cannot talk about spies in Istanbul without talking about Kim Philby. The most famous double agent in history spent years in Istanbul as the head of British intelligence. Philby loved Istanbul. He loved the bars, the history, and the complexity. But while he was drinking with his American colleagues at the Park Hotel, he was passing every single secret to the KGB. He was the one who betrayed the stay-behind agents in Albania and the Ukraine, men who had been trained in Turkey and sent across the border to their deaths.
Imagine Philby sitting on the balcony of his apartment in Beyoğlu, looking out over the Golden Horn. He is a charming man, a gentleman spy. You can hear the ice clinking in his glass of gin and tonic. He looks at the sunset, the sky turning a deep, bruised orange over the domes of Fatih. He is a man living a total lie. He knows that the men he just sent on a mission are being met by a Soviet firing squad because of the note he sent that morning. But he feels no guilt. To him, Istanbul is just a board in a game of 3D chess. The bridge is just a metaphor. When Philby eventually defected to Moscow in 1963, the intelligence community in Istanbul collapsed in a wave of paranoia. If Philby was a traitor, who could be trusted? The CIA started investigating the MI6. The Turks started investigating the Americans. The Bridge of Spies became a bridge of broken mirrors. Espionage in Istanbul wasn't all radio signals and dossiers. Much of it was sexpionage. The city was famous for its honey traps. Imagine a lavish party in a yali, a waterfront mansion in Yenikoi. The air is filled with the scent of jasmine, expensive champagne, and the salty breeze from the water. The music is a mix of American jazz and Turkish music. A Soviet naval attaché, bored with his drab life in Moscow, meets a beautiful, displaced white Russian countess or a sophisticated Turkish socialite. They walk along the marble terrace. The water of the Bosphorus laps gently against the stone, a hypnotic, rhythmic sound. The seduction is slow, professional, and deadly. A few weeks later, there are photographs. A few weeks after that, there is a request for information. This was the soft war. Istanbul, with its history of decadence and mystery, was the perfect environment for it. The KGB and the CIA both ran houses of pleasure where the bedrooms were wired for sound and the mirrors were two-way. You can hear the soft rustle of silk and the quiet pop of a cork. It's a world of luxury that hides a terrifying reality. In the 1960s, more Soviet secrets were traded in the bedrooms of Istanbul than in all the bunkers of NATO. As we move into the 1970s, the golden age of Istanbul espionage began to turn dark. The city became more violent. The strategy of tension we discussed in the Gladio episode turned the streets of Istanbul into a war zone. The spies were still there, but they were no longer gentlemen.
They were urban guerrillas. The bridge was now a front line. The Bosphorus was no longer a romantic view, it was a dumping ground for the bodies of those who knew too much. The atmosphere changed from noir to gritty. The scent of jasmine was replaced by the scent of tear gas. But the geography didn't change. Istanbul was still the only way out for the Soviets and the only way in for the West. We often focus on the CIA or KGB officers, but the true tragedy of the Bridge of Spies were the local assets, the Turkish translators, the boat captains, the hotel clerks. These people were the disposable parts of the machine. They were paid enough to live, but never enough to leave. When a mission went wrong, they were the ones who were left behind. Imagine an old boatman who has spent 30 years ferrying passengers across the Bosphorus at night. His hands are like leather, scarred by the ropes and the salt. He sits in a coffee house in Üsküdar, his eyes milky with cataracts.
The Bridge of Spies is not a physical structure. It is a state of mind. It is the realization that between the East and the West, there is always a middle ground, a place of shadows, whispers, and moral gray areas. Istanbul is the sentinel that never sleeps. It has seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of ideologies, and through it all, it has kept its secrets. Istanbul was the front line of the Cold War. But as the 20th century drew to a close, a new and even more terrifying threat began to emerge from the ruins of the Soviet Union. Not a political threat, but a technical one. A weapon that could bypass the Bosphorus, bypass NATO, and bypass every spy in the Pera Palace. What happens when the red phone in the White House rings, but there is no one on the other end? How did a group of rogue Soviet scientists create a dead hand system that could end the world even if every human being was dead? That is the story of our next season, The Dead Hand, the ghost of the Soviet machine.